Hi, Misha here. And you've noticed I haven't done much with Eaglemoss the last few months. And that's because there seemed to have been a bit of a deadlock over there. They weren't really putting out many new Star Trek models. But it seems like in July, the block has kind of been lifted. They've figured things out. They've started putting new models on their website and shipping new to subscriber. And this is number 150 in the collection. A model that Star Trek seems rather obsessed with, and a name that Star Trek seems rather obsessed with. This is another Miranda Class variant, and this is the Uss Antares, or Antares. And the reason I say they are obsessed with this name is because we have so many Antares class ships. We have the Zoza, we have the one from TOS, we have the Bajoran Antares freighter, and we have others. It's one of those names. And the Miranda class. There are really a total of 6 variants seen on screen, acknowledged. And this has been featured for a very long time. So since we have another Miranda variant, and pretty much I think the last one we're going to get because they're kind of out of ones to do now, I thought why not break out the other Mirandas again and just talk about them. Can you see the difference? There are differences. I actually did kind of a compilation with 4 of these back in the winter, because I thought that was all we'd ever get from Eaglemoss. I couldn't have dreamed they would have done the Antares version, but hey, why not? On the left we have the original Miranda Class, Uss Reliant. Then we have the Lantree, Uss Lantree variant. Then we have the Uss Bozeman. This is called the Soyuz Class, but in reality it's a Miranda. Then we have the Uss Saratoga, actually the second Miranda Class Uss Saratoga we've seen on screen. And then again, for our one today, we have the Uss Antares. And I pretty much have lined them up in chronological order as pretty much seen in the series and in the Star Trek chronology. The Reliant is about the oldest one we know of. Of course, we saw it in Wrath of Khan. In the real world, this was the first Starfleet ship seen on screen in a live-action format, besides the Constitution, the Enterprise type. It's speculated that the class was first introduced in 2245 or 2250. We know that the USS Reliant was in service before 2267 because its name and registry appears on a star base manifest for repair. Originally, it would have been a TOS style with the old school nacelles and more plain hull. We don't know if it would have the roll bar or not. And some have said this original name was the Anton class. But then the series was upgraded in the 2270s, just like the Constitution. And actually it's said that the USS Reliant was the first of its type to be upgraded. Thus, the refit could be considered the Reliant class. Either way, in the 23rd century when these introduced, they were considered to be medium cruisers with scientific patrol and other duties. Obviously, we know they were used for survey missions because that's what they were doing in Wrath of Khan. This version is approximately 234 meters long. It has roughly 11 decks with a crew of about 200 to 220. Of course, we have the engines down below. We have shuttle bays in the back. Our weapons are actually housed in this roll bar. We have front and rear firing photon torpedo tubes. Some sources also claim it has pulse disruptors, one on each side. Again, front and rear firing. This was originally the idea, although the whole pulse phaser was never really carried through in the actual film, so it more or less just had standard phasers. But it's kind of neat to think that it would have extra power phasers, making it a punchy little ship, even though it would be smaller than a Constitution. It's basically said it didn't have quite the defensive capability of a Constitution. It couldn't take as much of a beating, but its offensive capability was increased because of the pulse phasers and, of course, the route over the warp nacelles, and it said that they channeled power directly from the warp nacelles. Of course, Khan took this over thanks to his fun little pets, and really did a damn good job of handing Kirk his ass, frankly. But like I said, this was the first model to be built. And we would see it on screen there and then. We would also see the first USS Saratoga in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. And it would be just a reuse of the Reliant model. Moving on, we have the Uss Lantree, which appeared in Season 2 of Star Trek The Next Generation in the episode Unnatural Selection. This is really when the name Miranda became accepted or canon. Before that, like I said, there were a few different names. Even the name Avenger Class was informally used quite a bit. But by Next Generation, Miranda Class became official, or about as official as anything gets. And this would appear. You notice the difference is the roll bar is missing. That's in the real world because it was broken. The model, the lighting, and everything wasn't working properly. And I'm sure given enough time they could have fixed it. But, you know, they were on a TV budget and a TV time scale. So, hey, just pull off the roll bar. Good choice. Because this wasn't considered a medium cruiser by the 24th century. 2364, 2365, 2366 time frame. The Miranda had become a light cruiser, and this was a Class 6 supply ship. It was used for, you know, basically resupplying colonies, labs, research stations. And also, by this time, the crew was greatly decreased. The Lantree had only around 30 people on board. You could easily say that part of it was because it was a transport ship. Also, you know, 100 years in the future, more automation, less people needed. It seems like in this era, Miranda classes could have anywhere from 26 to 35 people on board standard. Of course, their size wouldn't change, but, you know, mission profiles. But at this point, again, light cruiser, resupply ship, still very much a science ship, as we saw with the USS Britannia. And also with the USS Britannia, we know that the Federation was still making these at least until 2345. So possibly they were still making them a century after they were first introduced. And maybe even longer. Of course, the real-world explanation was it became an iconic and popular model, so they kept using it. But in universe, we can say that it was a, relatively easy to make, not too big, not too little, good for lots of things, a very modular and adaptable and upgradable design. I guess, it was like the Federation's bird of prey. Moving on, we have the Soyuz Class. Which appeared in the episode Cause and Effect. It was captained by Dr. Fraser. Dr. Crane. It was sucked through a time warp and sent forward. I believe they said they came from the year 2278, so we know it was in service a little before the Wrath of Khan. In the episode, they said this is an old Soyuz class, but yeah, it's basically a Miranda with other bits stuck on. And underneath the saucer as well. A lot of people, well, the production people say all these things stuck on are sensors. They're guns. Literally, they took guns from a model battleship kit and stuck them on. So, call them sensors if that's what you need to do to make the Romulans happy. They're phaser guns. It's been said in kind of beta canon that this was a Coast Guard cutter type ship, like a patrol ship. I like that idea. That would explain the extra guns and why they were different from just regular phasers. And also, we don't have the roll bar, so we don't have our typical weapons housed where we would have on the original. So, yeah, not having them on the Lantree makes sense. But, if it were a border patrol ship. But, personally, one of my favorite Miranda variants, maybe my absolute favorite, and it was from a really good episode, too. Moving along, we saw this one in reality a year or so after, but in universe this actually came before. But then again, this is from the 23rd century and this is from the 24th. This is the Saratoga, the second Miranda Saratoga, the one that Lieutenant Commander Benjamin Sisko was first officer on, and that was sent into the Battle of Wolf 359. And, that did not fare so well. Although I guess it fared better than some, because at least it had survivors. Many ships in that did not. It does not have the roll bar. It has instead these pods on the side. Often claimed to be sensor pods. I could buy that more. That makes sense. Because it was a science type ship. So I'll let them call these actual sensor pods more than the Soyuz. We do know from the Emissary episode of Deep Space Nine that this did have photon torpedoes and phasers, and that they were relocated to the hull. So possibly this had a smaller crew too, like other Next Generation era ships. And that, some of the space was taken up by moving the weapons internally. We can also assume by this point that the speed has been increased. It was never really said on screen what the Miranda could do, but it's been estimated that its cruise was anywhere from 5 to 7, and that maximum warp was around 9. But I think this is a neat model too. This was actually the second we got in the collection. And it's neat for how it applies to Cisco and how it was in a major Federation battle. And then finally, we come to our new ship today, and most recent from Eaglemoss. This one has a pod on top. I don't know, weapons pod, sensor pod. It reminds me of what we see on some Nebula classes. So instead of a roll bar, it also has these small pods on each side. So basically, instead of a roll bar, we have two small pods and a large pod. And since we see this more in the Dominion War era, we might assume or think that it's a little more upscaled, up-armed. But it was basically just made for background shots, so was never a primary hero ship. The only other variant of the Miranda that exists is there was a Deep Space Nine Dominion War version. It had recolored warp engines, and some of them had an additional impulse engine grafted onto the design. So basically just a few different colorations. We could theorize that they had an upgraded warp system or all that. They were made faster because by the late 24th century, these had been kind of reclassified again, first from medium cruiser to light cruiser. Now we're kind of more in a combat escort or destroyer classification. And considering how quickly these got blowed up by Jim Hadar and Cardassian ships during that war, I hope they were running skeleton crews of only a couple of dozen people. I'd hate to think they had 200 folks on board every time one went boom on screen, because they were cannon fodder. You had to have things blowing up in a battle. So that's what these were. But they kept using them, so I guess they worked. And you saw how many were in the series, so it shows you just how many the Federation produced. They must have made hundreds of Miranda types. And really not much is known about the history of this one. It was just, again, kind of a background filler. I'm not even sure they know who at the studio actually came up with it. It's neat. I'm glad they made it. What's kind of also neat about how Eaglemoss has done these, you'd think they would just reuse the same exact mold, modifying it as needed, but there's a few telltales between these that show that they actually use different molds. For example, the Miranda here is ever so slightly smaller than the Lantree. I'd imagine they made the Lantree just a little bit bigger because it's a simpler model and they wanted to, kind of give more value. But it does seem like they more or less started over fresh with each one. So, construction is roughly the same on all of these. I have to say, I do like the simple, clean lines of the Lantree. It also feels a little heavier, a little more, like it has a little more metal in it. I like it for that. But like I said, I also really like how the Soyuz is kind of the opposite. It has the most stuff stuck on and kind of the most interesting appearance. So, I guess I like kind of the two extremes. That's not to put a patch on the original, of course, but that we've had models of the Reliant forever, so, and this was early on in the collection. And the Saratoga is neat, but it's basically just the same with two pods. So, I would actually rank the new Uss Antares as my number 3 for favorite. Then the Saratoga at number 4. And then, I'm sorry, I'm going to put the Reliant last. But it's not a bad. I mean, someone's got to be last. And again, since it's kind of the most common, and also it was an earlier model from Eaglemoss, so it's not quite as good as some of the later ones. I don't know. They've sometimes improved, but that's just my taste. And I just thought I would share this with you. Try to give you some Star Trek content since we've been doing mostly real-world fighter models. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments, please share them below. And if you could, like, share, subscribe, and check out some of my other videos. This is Misha, and I will trek you next time.